It's Anthony Semann from Semann Slattery, and I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Peter Moss, the 2023 Semann Slattery Thinker in Residence. I want to acknowledge that we're filming on the land of the Gadigal people, which is part of the Eora Nation. And Semann Slattery maintains its commitment to undo the harmful and ongoing effects of colonisation, alongside Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues. So Peter, the book Beyond Quality is well known for many of us in the early years, an education sector that you co-authored with your colleagues Gunilla Dahlberg and Alan Pence. What was the driving force behind that book?
Well, I think it was the end, or an important stage in a process which had been going on for some time, for me at least, which was trying to address what we call in the book the problem with quality. And the problem with quality, which began to emerge in the 1980s in work I was doing in Europe, but with other people as well, was how did quality, the concept of quality, cope once you began to factor in ideas like context, subjectivity, participation and democracy, the idea that there were different perspectives on things in education. How could you rethink, reconceptualize, or do something with quality in those rather new type of circumstances and thinking?
Look, it's a pioneering book, and I would say 25 years down the track, it still troubles people, the content. Do you think we've moved closer to troubling quality?
Well, I think on one hand the book's been an enormous success if you just look at the metrics. You know, it's sold a lot for an academic book. It's in 12 language translations. It's been cited thousands of times. On the other hand, it has failed in one of its tasks, which was to say, using quality, the concept of quality, the term of quality is a choice. And if you choose to use quality, then you have to recognize that you are taking on board certain assumptions, certain values, a particular paradigm, we would say, a way of looking at the world. And there are alternative ways of working, there are alternative languages of evaluation. And one of the interesting things in the book's evolution was when it was translated into Italian by Reggio Children, they changed our subtitle from Postmodern Perspectives to Languages of Evaluation, and we like that. So that is how it is now in its third English edition, because really it was getting to the core, which are there are different ways of thinking, talking about, and doing evaluation. Quality is one method, and now which we would say, and I think it's increasingly clear, is the product of neoliberalism and new public management. It's a particular way of thinking and doing things, a particular way of seeing education in the schools and young children. So really what many people, I find when people come to me and they use the word quality, they look like I've talked about the death of a dear relative. They don't quite know how to continue the conversation because they know somehow I'm not easy with it, but they don't know how else to talk. And I have been trying to say we have other ways of talking about things that are important to us.
So one of the central tenets one might suggest is that we need to think about quality differently, and you do trouble the concept of quality. So could you talk to us about the constraints of the current landscape in talking about and writing about quality?
Yeah, I don't want, what we're saying is that people have tried to think of quality differently,
yes,
tried to cope with all these ideas about multiple perspectives, context, blah, 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 and it doesn't work because quality assumes there is a universal objective set of standards that you can measure. If you're into issues to do with diversity, etc., you have to move to a different language, a different way of thinking. For example, I would not talk about a quality early childhood education. I would talk about an early childhood education of democracy, experimentation and potentiality, which expresses my political take on education and which actually puts myself up for people to say either what do you mean or we don't go along with that. And that, whereas if I just say quality early childhood education, we either all nod our heads and say yes, yes, quite. Or we're completely bemused. We've no idea what we're actually talking about. So I'm trying to, and the book is trying to bring politics, which is in fact one of the themes of my visit, that we need to bring politics back into education, which means we are confronted with political choices, and those are political choices we need to be arguing, discussing and making choices about.
Do you know, I remember hearing a colleague saying the most important things in life are quite often hard to measure. Do you think that's perhaps one of the constraining forces in people thinking about democracy or alternatives to measurable outcomes of quality? Do you think that plays into why people are so troubled by it?
Well, I think if you use another language of evaluation, you move towards working with other methods.
Yep.
I'm not against the quantitative or measuring things, but they have to be the right sort of things. I'm very pleased that when I fly in a plane, an engineer has presumably measured the wings or something so that they're exactly right and they won't fall off. I think that's really important. And one of the points I would make is we tend to confuse something like aeroplanes and flying with education and schools, and they're quite different things. Yes. And so if I fly in a plane, I want to find a quality plane because I want to think that it meets universal objective standards. I don't want to think there are multiple perspectives on flying. So it takes us into thinking about different ways of evaluating. It takes us into ways of thinking about judgment. So in a way, instead of making a statement of fact, you're moving into the idea of a judgment of value. And that means you are working with and interpreting many different things through, for example, methods such as pedagogical documentation.
Which we'll touch on.
Which we'll come on to.
Yeah.
But what I would also say is, in a way, all the language of quality people have been able to spend millions and millions of pounds and enormous resources in general on developing tools for measurement. Whereas alternatives, of course, in the last 30 years have simply been ignored and have depended on a few people in a few places working on alternatives. So I think we have quite a way to go in saying how we would deal with a different language of evaluation or different languages, because there may be other ones. Yes. But I'm sure that we will get there. But there will be a different sort of evaluation. They will not end up with a number, for example. They would end up with a judgment, a discussion, if you like, an analysis of the situation, which has come about ideally through some sort of democratic process of people working on trying to make meaning and deepen understanding about what it is that they are looking at and thinking and seeing.
It's interesting, one of the criticisms, the unfounded criticisms, perhaps the misreading of this alternative is that quality means anything goes. No. And I've heard people say, oh, so we're throwing out the definition of quality. Yeah. Does that lower the bar to anything goes? How might someone respond to that argument of quality means nothing matters?
We talk in the book about the bugbear of relativism because of that, exactly that argument comes up. To which the argument would be that, on the contrary, we're talking about very rigorous processes, so that you have to have a very rigorous discussion, analysis about what is important to you, what it is that you want from education. Political choices are not easily made, and they should be constantly provisional and open to thinking about again. And then one needs to look very carefully, in great depth, at the degree to which those choices are being enacted in education and schools and things. So pedagogical documentation, for anybody who's gone into it, like my colleague Gunilla Dahlberg, but people at Reggio Emilia, for example, is an extremely rigorous, extremely exhaustive process of really digging deep, much deeper than the checklist. But you have to move away from expecting what checklists deliver, which is a number. But by the way, on a very, very banal state, I actually think things like health and safety should be dealt with by regulations, but exactly in the same way we have regulations for office buildings, bridges or whatever. So I'm not saying that something as basic and important as health and safety is. You have pedagogical documentation about, there we're into aeroplanes again, we want to know there's universal objective standards. But once we move into pedagogy, once we move into processes, then we're into a different language.
It's interesting, I've just picked up, and I'm sure you've mentioned it many times, but it's just landed on my ears. You've used the word evaluation, analysis, not measurement.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's the departure points when we think about quality, that dialoguing through it, not measuring it.
And again, funnily enough, in my thinking about it, I would like some things measured to be factored in as documentation. For example, I would want to know things like which children are going to this place on there. What about the staff? What is the turnover? Things like that, which seems to me to be part. If you like, you could regard those sorts of numbers as documents, which don't necessarily immediately tell you anything, but you feed into the process of documentation, which is one of discussion, interpretation, etc., etc.
Yeah. So it's not an either-or situation.
No, not at all. I mean, I think there's a place for numbers, and I've worked with very big numbers. I actually work with people who know how to do it, but I think it's really, really important. So it's not either-or. It's actually saying when is it appropriate, and what do you do when you've got a number? The danger is people say with a number it tells us something.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell us anything. It enables us to think and to interpret.
So we're still safe to fly?
Well, we hope so, yes. But again, I would say, of course, that probably involves interpretation by specialists. So certain things, like the safety of a building, I don't think should be left to the general public.
Yes.
But then again, you're making judgments about
Absolutely.
that.
So Peter, you've shared in your time with us some really interesting quotes around the story of quality. And if I can just read part of this, then I've got a question to ask. And this comes from the World Bank, where they say scaling up families' access to quality childcare has the potential to unlock pathways of poverty, build human capital, and increase equity, all of which are cornerstones of a country's economic growth and productivity. Expanding quality childcare can yield multi-generational impacts by promoting equity, improving women's employment and productivity, child outcomes, family welfare, business productivity, and overall economic development. We often hear things like return on investment, future benefits. What are your concerns about that story of quality?
Where to start? Where to start? Well, first of all, again, it uses quality, and I'm none the wiser when I've read it or you've read it out, what is important to them. And I don't know whether it would be what was important to me. So what they're doing is depoliticizing the whole area, and if you like, using quality as a mask to hide their values and assumptions and their perspectives, etc. It's a decontextualized statement by a World Bank, and as often happens in these cases, it quite often draws on local studies being done in place A, which is a tiny part of a bigger place, which is a tiny part of the world. I'm a bit allergic to childcare. I think we should be talking about early childhood education. And childcare is a very narrowing concept. I totally believe that services for young children should take account that parents are employed or studying, but that should not be the way that we define or think about them in the first place. We should think about them as education, which also does other things. The whole investment thing begs so many questions. I think it's over-egged. I think the claims that are made are actually, in practice, difficult to sustain. They lead to a mistaken idea that early childhood education is, as I've said on other occasions, a sort of magic potion that will solve all sorts of problems, when I think we should think of it always as part of a bigger struggle for justice and democracy, amongst other things. So what it tends to do is load on this enormous superstructure of expectation. And when you tend to look at countries like the US, where this discourse is very common, and you look at what the result is of 60 years of early intervention, it doesn't really look so brilliant, in fact. And that's because there are many other things working in the United States against change and improvement. I also don't like it because it's a very narrow economistic view. I mean, for me, there are many other purposes and aims of early childhood education over and above these possible economic returns. I suppose the other thing, I need to say that I think that education always has an economic role, but I think it has many other roles: social, cultural, political, environmental, etc., etc. And we've got hooked on the economic, which also, again, today begs the huge question of what economy? Because we obviously at a time of enormous crisis going on, where we know we can't continue as we are, that's killing us. And therefore, to keep using these old economic investment tropes as if the only thing is how we can compete better in this environment is not only dangerous, perhaps, but also fails to open up to a proper discussion of what sort of economy. Can we imagine a sustainable economy? Can we imagine an economy that works for people, not for corporate? All those sorts of questions. So I suppose what it adds up to is something that is very glib, unthoughtful, as if they never read anything beyond. I think it's typical of the sort of stuff you get in this field. People read each other's reports and basically recycle them. And there's a dozen studies which turn up in various formats. And you have the sense that they have never read the increasing literature and the rich literature which looks at early childhood education in other ways. Not least Reggio Emilia, but there's lots and lots of other stuff. It's narrow, economistic and technical.
Yeah, I quite like that argument that it's not a magic potion, but we need to rest the arguments on issues like democracy and equity. But it does speak to a world, a neoliberal world that is enticed by money as a reason to invest.
Which sees the world entirely in terms of economic relationships and valuations. And it can't, I mean, in a way, that's a definition of neoliberalism as a process of economization. Everything is reduced to cost, benefits, calculation, all that sort of thing. So there's a balance to be struck, it seems to me, between dismissing what I think are these magic potion ideas, on the other hand saying early child education, like all education, has a very important role, along with many other things, to create a solidaristic, democratic, caring, sustainable society, which I hope many of us want. But we shouldn't load it as being the only way to achieve that. We need to think about challenges, things like redistribution, insecurity. 101 other things that we need to take seriously.
Do you believe the postmodern project that has alerted us to rethink quality to date has been successful?
In some respects, on the one hand, yes, on the other hand, no. It seems to me that what has happened in early childhood education, maybe more than in other fields of education, I'm not sure, is that there is a very vibrant, very widespread, what I would call a resistance movement, by which I mean people who are working with, exploring, do really interesting things with alternative paradigms, alternative theory and theorists, alternative perspectives. And you can see that everywhere. Of course, there's the reconceptualizing early childhood education movement. There's the Reggio Emilia movement, which is global. There are people writing books, including our colleague Stefani, who's just published yet another excellent book on Reggio Emilia. There are students doing PhDs in these things I get to examine, etc., etc. On the other hand, none of this seems to penetrate into what you might call the mainstream discourse, which is where the policies are made. And I sometimes worry a bit that the resistance movement is rightly trying to explore these very exciting ideas, and it doesn't engage enough with challenging the policy field. And the policy field, I think, has very strong gatekeepers, which very much control what filters through, and make sure that policymakers and other people, don't actually get exposed to things. But they, of course, I think, are very much inscribed with neoliberal, positivist, whatever you want to call it, ideas. So, it's difficult for them to take on board. And I suppose my analysis is that whole world has come to a tipping point, and we're increasingly seeing that it's not going to do for us in the future, or indeed for the present, because it's been that sort of world that has led, in large part, to these enormous crises we have today. So we're facing the end of an order, end of an era. We don't quite know what's going to emerge, but unfortunately, the mainstream discourse is a bit like a zombie. It lumbers on.
Yeah. You know, maybe we take comfort in the words of Foucault, who says not everything is bad, but everything has the potential to be dangerous. So maybe we need to keep struggling with the world of quality.
And also what he says is basically, if you can think differently, that's it. I think it's a wonderful way to say, if you can think differently, then basically change becomes very necessary, very difficult, and very possible. So I think a lot of this is about helping people to change a way of thinking, often in ways they want to go. Perhaps they haven't had the material, etc., to articulate. Yeah. So I think helping people to articulate the deep unease. I think many people have a deep unease about the world they're in, and also early childhood education. But it's difficult to kind of rethink, and that's something we can do. I think can really help people to come and say, you mean if I go to this place? I get it. Yeah,
Well, I suppose in closing for this little video, I think Beyond Quality will still be a seminal work, perhaps in another 25 years. That project perhaps won't be completed by then.
Well, I think it may have a second coming, because I think, if I'm right, and I'm not the only one thinking this, that we're at the end of an epoch, or whatever you want to call it. Something new is emerging, and I hope it speaks to that new that emerges, so it may have a new audience.
Well, we thank you and your thinking and your colleagues, Gunilla and Alan Pence, for troubling quality.